Welcome to the Thinklings podcast, a conversation where good thoughts help renew the mind with the Word of God. I'm Charlie Carter, and I'm here with Tim Little and Andy Stearns. Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome to the Thinklings podcast. Hello, Tim.
Shalom, Charlie.
Shalom. This is a sleepy Tim.
I am a little sleepy.
Yes. But
you discerned that, huh?
Yeah. Well, it's a little later. Well, it's not a little later.
No, it's about normal.
About normal. But we've had long days. And so you were selling some books today.
Yeah, so this last weekend I was at a marriage conference. I was speaking at a marriage conference in Clarinda, Iowa. We had a really good time chatting through Song of Songs. Had some really positive feedback, and I was encouraged. And I think the Lord really used His word in the lives of a few couples, so that was really good. And then today there's a conference at Soteria of Des Moines, the Great Exchange. And so I was out there visiting with some pastors and took a few books out. So I am fresh back from that. And well, I don't know, it was a few hours ago. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's, I say this sometimes. I don't know if I've ever said this on air, which I will say this. I'm about to talk about Blue Cow, which is not a sponsor, but maybe one day will be a sponsor. And if you're wondering who Blue Cow is, Blue Cow Moving and Storage, that's the greatest moving and storage company in the Des Moines Metro. Give us a call. Anyway,
which is where you work.
Oh yeah, I and also I work there. Anyway, but something I say often off air now is that the Blue Cow waits for no man, and yeah,
is that a tagline?
No,
it sounds like a Charlie.
It's a Charlie tagline. Our actual tagline is "Relax, it's a Blue Cow move." But I just say all the time, the Blue Cow waits for no man. You know, it's like you're always got more to do there,
right?
But it is, if we could call it our off season, this is our off season. So less moves happening in October through March than in the other months of the year.
Gotcha.
So, but today was a surprisingly busy day. It's funny because so last weekend we had a lot of rain and clouds and cold.
Yeah.
And anecdotally, any time that we have precipitation, guess what people don't want to plan when it's raining or snowing?
Interesting. Yeah.
When they move. It just like shuts it down. And the end of last week, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, so slow. And then what was today?
Sunny.
Beautiful, sunny, and people are like, oh my, I need to move. And we had a lot of phone calls today. And I think it's, the pendulum swings the other way because nobody called on the weekend. So,
You got hammered today.
4 to 6 o'clock tonight was quite busy. People get off of work and they're like, let's call that big old Blue Cow.
There we go.
So anyway, yeah, things are good. I get a lot of reading done these last couple of days. So anyway, so here's what's in this episode. And let me click to the right tab so I can see that. We have one announcement, which is we're going to rebrand. You're going to rebrand, right? It's a cow pun. Anyway, so the Andy's quote of the week, we're going to start calling that Andy's Weekly Wisdom.
There we go.
As if it was coming from Andy as a wise quote that he would provide. But since he is absent, in his absence, we will share his wisdom for him.
There we go.
It's his entry to our books and business.
Uh-huh.
And so we're going to have Andy's Weekly Wisdom, and then we're going to quickly reply to an email that came in a while ago from Randy Vodder out in Colorado. And then we're going to get to our books and business and main topics of the episode, where for books and business, we're just going to talk about things we've started reading or planning to read in the coming days here. And then we're going to talk about burnt offerings. Tim Thinkling Little wrote an article for Logos recently about, I really like the title, Favor by Fire.
My wife came up with it.
He who finds a wife finds a good thing. And so we're going to talk about Favor by Fire by Tim Little, about burnt offerings. And we're going to close the podcast with a final meditation from Hebrews 1. Whew. I don't know, I kind of like rocking through that script
Yeah.
at the beginning. It kind of helps kind of organize things.
Yeah. How about that?
It only took us like 160 of these to figure that out. All right. So Andy's weekly wisdom.
What do we got?
This is again from A.G. Sertange. Okay. I will say this is complete nonsense. I was on X, formerly Twitter. Actually, it was today. And I saw a thread. It was a poll. And it had 4 names. It had C.S. Lewis, Spurgeon, G.K. Chesterton, and what was the other one? And Martin Luther. It said, which of these 4 is the most quotable? And I replied to that and I said, A.G. Sertange.
Everybody's like, who the world is he?
There's so many quotes from this. It's unbelievable. But I can't, yeah. Anyway, maybe we'll talk about that poll someday. So here's the quote. This is in the same chapter we've been kind of slowly working through. So the organization of life. And he has had a handful of subheadings here. And so I'll read through those again, kind of get the context. So you have the organization of life. He talks about simplifying his life. You know, when one thinks of a man of genius, you don't think of him dining out. We had that quote earlier. We talked about solitude. So having moments of silence and solitude, that's part number 2. Part 3 was cooperation with one's fellows. And we quoted that on a previous week, where to have the association with your friends to discuss good books. It's almost like a Thinklings podcast. Last week in that same section, we talked about friendship being an obstetric art. So it births things. And so it takes 2 people to really have something. And that's where you need good friends to really draw out from you what you're worth. And so the very next section is called the cultivation of necessary contacts. So it's not necessarily your friends, but it's the other appointments and things in life, people you're going to, see and talk to that maybe you don't always want to talk to. And so there's a lot of fun things in here. He's like, well, what do you do when you have to spend time with like a fool? It's like, well, you can even learn things from the fool. There's a good quote about that, but I didn't pick that one. What he's talking about at the very end of this, so you're having these relationships that aren't necessarily directly influencing your intellectual life. And he says this throughout the book, where you kind of want to live your whole life as an intellectual. You don't like take days off. You don't take appointments off. So like even when you're, doing some nonsense with, something you don't want to be at, has nothing to do with your books, has nothing to do with your writing, whatever. You need to still act in that moment. You need to be careful how you, drain yourself, how you use yourself in those moments. And he kind of talks about how you speak when you're in a place that's not intellectual. Like, you're spending time with a bunch of fools. Do you want to get into this really deep conversation? You probably won't get into a really deep conversation with a bunch of fools. It's like you need to be careful about how you speak and present yourself all of the time. This is kind of like a side note to a side note, but it's a really good quote. In the context of how you speak amongst contexts that aren't purely intellectual, he talks about using your silence. And so here's the quote.
You spent like 5 minutes setting this up.
I know. Well, because if you just rip it out of context, it loses some of the like.
Well, just the whole idea about being around people who are really or purely, would you say purely intellectual? And so that's a conversation in and of itself, but we can walk away from that, at least for right now.
Yeah, it's actually really funny.
Maybe even people who are actually walking in a pursuit of truth, like real truth.
Yeah.
Because the fool's not.
Yeah. And in case you're wondering, if you're struggling with that part of life, like you're like spending all your time with people that, don't really care about the life of the mind. Whose responsibility Sertange says that is? The wife. And this is not my quote. Page 60. The wife of an intellectual should see to that. She should not open her house at random. Her tact should be a sort of seed. More than the society of the great world, she should esteem that of noble spirits. So the wife should help the husband not spend time with fools. So like who you invite over for dinner matters. ladies. Okay, anyway. So
that's like another can of worms. Anyway, read the actual quote that you
big
had
old
prepared.
can of worms.
Yes.
Anyway, so I'm just going to read the sentence.
Uh-huh.
And if we want to broaden out to the paragraph, we can. Silence is the hidden content of the words that count. Silence is the hidden content of the words that count. So it's a really artistic and beautiful way to say, like, short is sweet. If you have to take hours and hours and hours and hours and hours to tell me the thing, there's probably a lot of nonsense in there. If you can just say it so short and then be quiet, that silence is the content of what matters, of the words that count.
Silence is the content of the words that count.
Silence is the hidden content of the words that count. So saying it and letting it sit. And specifically, he's not talking about a presentation in front of intellectuals, and he's not talking about writing a paper. He's talking about the way you interact with people who don't necessarily add to your intellectual pursuits. And in those moments, he says, why not be brief? And your silence is going to do more there. Your silence is the content in those moments. It's not your...
So is he actually saying to just say something brief? Is that what he's arguing for in the paragraph?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Besides, that is the way to give weight to one's words. So it's kind of like an addendum to a side thought about how you interact with people at like random parties you don't want to be at.
Well, I mean, it's like you're in a situation and somebody has a question and then the way that the question is worded, or even the question itself, is like a whole conversation that you're going to need like 2 or 3 hours to work through. Well, what do? You can't begin that kind of a conversation to actually address it. So it's almost like that's when you throw out a proverb or an enigma, according to like Proverbs 1:6, 1:5 and 6, where it's just to get them thinking maybe in the right direction or something. I could see that. That's an interesting selection.
Yeah, and Carter. I don't think he comes out and actually says what you just said.
Yeah.
But that's where it's like, if you're spending time with fools and you throw out this enigmatic statement, only the ones that really want it are going to follow up on it.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even necessarily say that they're fools, but even maybe they're just somebody who is a little more naive and they just don't know.
Yeah.
So they walk up and they have some kind of a question for you, and you're like, that's a huge conversation. And you maybe just give them a little sentence that kind of sends them in a specific direction if they really want to go for it.
And, since we're talking about fools all the time, we'll just cap it by reading the statement about fools. And yet even fools have their place in serving us and completing our experience. Page 60. Anyway, so they're...
Completing our experience?
Yeah, like
it's fine.
You have to live in reality, and fools are a part of reality in that sense. But I think he's trying to be kind and saying, like, you don't view yourself as an intellectual and then make a list of all the stupid people and like, well, I'm not going to spend time with any of the stupid people.
Oh, okay.
And he's like, no, like, there are tons of people out there and you can benefit from every one of them. You shouldn't seek them out, and maybe your wife should help you there. Like, but, anyway, at the very end of all of that, silence.
I don't know, that whole wife thing, there's something going on there. Anyway.
I think he's just trying to quippily say, is quippily a word? I think he's trying to pithy and tactfully say, the wife should help their husband, and again, this is written in a very different cultural context.
Right.
Obviously it's not woke in any sense, and it's not, PC to our modern culture.
Right.
But he's saying, okay, here's your husband who's trying to devote 2 hours a day to the life of his mind. If you invite an absolute nincompoop over for dinner, guess what you just did?
Right.
That day's gone.
And essentially, it sounds like there's some kind of personal story connected to that kind of a statement, I guess is what I'm trying to refer to.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure there is. Anyway, so that's Andy's weekly wisdom. Silence is the hidden content of the words that count. Any other thoughts there?
No.
Man, talk about being brief. And that took, 10 minutes. All right, we'll be really brief with this next one. Listener interaction. And just to remind you, Tim, did you know that the Thinklings have an email?
I do.
Yeah, and that is thinklingspodcast@gmail.com. And we would love for you, if you're listening to this, to send us an email. And in that email, you can just say, hey, Charlie's clearly my favorite of the three, and the other two are tied for second. You could say that. Or you could ask a question that we could ask on air. You could send us something that you thought was interesting, and maybe we will read it and discuss it, which is what this one is. So we had Randy Vodder, who is out in Colorado, and he sent in a Lewis article. I don't have the name of it pulled up right in front of me, and we'll talk about it fully in a future episode. But it's kind of like How to Live Your Life by C.S. Lewis type of an idea, and pulled some quotes from Lewis's writing, kind of comes up with these ideas, and Randy's like, hey, what do you think about this? And so I spent some time thinking through that article, reading it, jotting down some thoughts. So we're going to talk about that on a future episode. And if in preparation for that, you would like to find and read this article as well, let's see, can I find it? It's medium.com. C.S. Lewis, 5 Cardinal Rules on Living a Good Life. And you can create a free account and you can read that article. And so medium.com, C.S. Lewis, 5 Cardinal Rules on Living a Good Life. And we'll discuss that in a future episode. So thank you for the suggestion, Randy. And I have so many tabs open. I can't find the tab I need. There we go. Hey, you know what, Tim? It's time for that thing we always do.
Books and business.
Let's talk about some books. You want to go first? You want me to go first?
So I have been busy not reading the books I need to read. I have to read by this. Well, the one I have to read by in 1 week. 5 Views on Christ in the Old Testament. It's a 5 views book. And I'm already familiar with Jason DeRucci's view because I heard him talk about it at ETS last year. And I did not like what he had to say. So I'm not sure where I'm going to land on this issue, but I'm part of a book reading group and I meet with them next Monday. So I have to have it done. So that's one I'm going to be reading. And that's all I've got for books and business this week. I've been busy working on other stuff.
Sure. Jason DeRucci, he's at Midwestern.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to read one of his books for a class a while back. He and Naselli did like a companion series. Naselli was How to Preach the New Testament, and he did How to Preach the Old Testament. And he's a Hebrew scholar, right?
He is, yeah.
Yeah.
So like he presents the redemptive historical Christocentric approach, which I think would be pretty popular in maybe our circles, but it's definitely popular in Reformed circles. But
would that be somewhat similar? It's people use different terms to sometimes refer to similar ideas. So like, would that be like a Brian Chappell type of a?
I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure where Chappell lands, but in his article, he basically exegetes 2 passages, I believe, incorrectly, and reads Christ into them incorrectly. So it was like, well, you're not doing a whole lot. But one of them is actually Genesis 22 with Abraham and Isaac.
Ding, 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 ding. We'll come back to that in a few moments, listener.
And then the second one is Lady Wisdom.
In Proverbs. You know what's so striking about that? He did, in his Old Testament book, he did like a mock word study on Hevel in Ecclesiastes. Yeah. And he's the only person that has ever, in my sense, knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, he probably did. I mean,
he did a great job.
Okay, so exegesis, he works through Proverbs 8, at least at the ETS article. So ETS, he did, and I'm pretty sure he just does the same thing here. And he exegetes it correctly. in which I was shocked that he still took a Christocentric approach to Lady Wisdom. That he says that Lady Wisdom is Jesus, okay? Which I am basically saying, no, Lady Wisdom's not Jesus. Lady Wisdom is the divine order of creation.
It's a huge stretch.
And so there's one verse that people who say that Lady Wisdom is Jesus, they basically are basing it on a mistranslation and interpretation of Proverbs 8:30. And he actually exegetes it right. And so at ETS, I asked him, so I applauded him because he actually exegeted this verse correctly. Let me see here. Then I was in Proverbs 8:30, Lady Wisdom is speaking. Then I was beside him as a master craftsman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him. So the I is Lady Wisdom, or Jesus, was beside him, that'd be God. And then the key phrase is as a master craftsman. So it seems like, and some have argued, Lady Wisdom is the creator of creation. And this is the only Old Testament text where presumably Lady Wisdom creates. And he correctly exegetes through this and says, no, it's not Lady Wisdom that's doing the creating. It's God the Father.
Yeah.
God the Father is the master craftsman. Lady Wisdom is just present there because Lady Wisdom is the blueprint, the order of creation. So I asked him at ETS, you exegeted this correctly, but where else in the Bible does it say that Lady Wisdom is divine or is creating? And he kind of had this look on his face and he said something, and I'm like, that didn't make any sense.
He didn't answer the question.
He didn't answer the question, but it's at ETS. It's fine. And it'd be interesting to follow up with him. I haven't had a chance.
Yeah.
But exegetically, this is his only text, and he exegetes it correctly, but still came to the wrong conclusion, I would contend, that Jesus
that's
is
wild.
Lady Wisdom. Oh, it was interesting. So anyway, that's my books and business, and
that's about as spicy as Tim's gonna get right there.
I'm tired already.
It's good. Beautiful.
All right, your turn.
Yeah, so kind of a lot of odds and ends. I'll give another shout out to Andy. He introduced me to Bookly, and that has been really helpful to like have on an app all of the books you are reading, where you're at in that book to know exactly where you left off, and then just a simple like, hey, just read 10 minutes, And so obviously been reading through Intellectual Life and getting pretty close through that one. And then I think I've mentioned this before, but I'll just bring it up again because I finally got into some meat of it. And this is For the Children's Sake, Foundations of Education for Home and School. And it's by Susan McCauley. And I heard about this through one of my pastors and just knew it intersected a lot of what we discuss in discipleship of children. And so logged it away in the back of my mind. Okay, that's a book we need to assign for this, and then that'll give me an excuse to analyze it as well. And so it talks about Charlotte Mason and her education philosophies, and I got into start reading this, and what I really liked was in the introduction. It captured me this isn't even the introduction. This is the foreword written by Susan McCauley's daughter. And she opens the foreword with the question, why is this book so compelling? Like, why is it still a favorite for people? And she throws this quote out in the middle of that first paragraph, and she had me locked in. Here's the quote. They began to appreciate Charlotte Mason's focus not so much on the acquisition of skills and facts. Like, is that what education is? Just skills and facts? No. But upon cultivating the life of the mind.
The intellectual life.
Yeah. And the life of the mind. And this is, by the way, this is a woman in the 1800s who is going to go on to be a teacher, and a great teacher, is appointed the dean of a college of education. And she's got, great ideas on philosophy of education for children. And she goes on to kind of accentuate the imagination and reading and just so many great things. And so that caught me in the forward. But then I got to the end of the acknowledgments. And here's now Susan McCulley saying, a very special thank you to my parents, Francis and Edith Schaefer. And that's where the light bulb goes on. And you look at the cover again, Susan Schaefer McCulley. This is Francis Schaefer's daughter, which definitely colors it in a little bit. Like she probably grew up in a decently intellectual and theological home. And so that, for better or for worse, instantly gave me like, there's a little bit more credibility to that now.
Yeah.
Like this is Francis Schaefer's daughter. And so just before we even got to chapter 1, some great intrigue there. And I did read through chapter 1. I'll save thoughts on that for when we address it in an episode fully, but good things for the children's sake. But with that, there is another thing I've read that I read in its entirety, and that was Favored by Fire by Tim Little, an article about burnt offerings. And so, Tim, if you would allow me to do this, I have outlined it as I read it. Like, here's the main points, and then you can just kind of, after I do that, jump in and tell us, where did this come from?
Yeah, that sounds
great.
Give
us the big ideas. Give us some more meat there.
I love it.
So as I read through this, and you can find this on, if you just search Logos, Favored by Fire, Tim Little on Google.
Yeah, I just did a Google search, Favored by Fire, Tim Little, and it popped right up.
And not hard to find. And here I would say is what I would call the thesis of the article. This is in the opening words. Understanding the history, and this is a quote, understanding the history, practice, and significance of the burnt offering will also help New Testament believers understand the sacrifice of Abraham and apply his example to their own Christian walk. And so we're going to understand burnt offering, and that's going to help us live out New Testament virtue. And so there are 5 main points in the article, and they all have the kind of the tag of the burnt offering. Okay. So you have number 1, the history of the burnt offering. Like, where did this come from? 2, the practice of the burnt offering. Like, what are they actually doing? 3, you have the significance of the burnt offering. So what does this mean? What are the worshipers seeking with the burnt offering? 4, there's the belief of the burnt offering. And I'll just put in quotes there, this was the most important part of it. And so we'll, I'm sure, come back to that. And then number 5, we have the New Testament burnt offering principle, where we draw application from what burnt offerings are. Do we see this same idea in the New Testament? And your conclusion was, yes, we do.
Yes.
So with that, set the table for you. Tell us about burnt offerings.
Well, so I was contacted by Mark Ward, and he asked me if I would like to write an article on burnt offerings. And I had a little bit of mixed emotions about that because, I mean, who cares about burnt offerings? As New Testament believers, nobody really gives a rip about burnt offerings. But I need to study this out. This was not something that I knew a lot about. So I ordered a couple of interlibrary loans. And I jumped online and got some articles, and then I began studying burnt offerings. And what I learned is that it's one of the oldest offerings. We see offering at the very beginning of the creation account. With Cain and Abel, they're already offering, making offerings, not burnt offerings. Theirs are not burnt offerings. They're probably more along the lines of a peace offering. But an offering nonetheless. The first burnt offering we see is in Noah.
Yeah.
So he offers a burnt offering in Genesis 8 after he gets off of the boat. And so there's no instruction, there's no explanation. It's just all of a sudden they are offering burnt offerings like somebody has already told them how and that it's necessary, and it's assumed. And that's the way that it's always been. We get some of that in Leviticus because Leviticus doesn't actually explain very much why they have to do burnt offerings, because it seems like they already knew why.
So, and as I read your article, I was kind of intrigued by that thought. So I think it could be a very easy assumption well, they're just getting this from like some pagan culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, and I tried to kind of think back through in my own instruction, what was I taught in Bible college or seminary about burnt offering? And I don't think we ever
No, we don't care.
really addressed it. But like, where did we get this idea from? And my best thought was that the Lord probably instructed them in offering, and it's just not specifically recorded in Scripture.
Correct.
Yeah.
That seems to be the situation.
Yeah.
So they're just doing it, and that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. He doesn't need to give a great explanation or whatever, because everybody was offering burnt offerings, whether it was to the Lord and in a properly ordered burnt offering, or if it was offered to Baal or whoever else. I mean, you have the competition between, the Lord and Baal on Mount Carmel, between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And I mean, everybody offered burnt offerings to their deities. So it was a really common offering that was performed. And then what was it? This was something interesting for me too. The worshiper was heavily involved in the process of offering a burnt offering. It wasn't just a, hey, throw money into an offering plate type of a thing, but you brought the animal, you were the one that slit the throat, you were the one that put your hand on the head, which according to, you cross-reference that with like Leviticus 16, it seems like they would put their hand on the head and say a prayer at that time. So we don't know that for sure, because it all just seems to be assumed. Everybody knew the whole practice and what you were to do and so on and so forth. But in Leviticus 16:21, it says, let me look it up here quick.
And while you look that up, you kind of mentioned that, there's different purposes of the burnt offering and like the types of offerings that the Israelites are performing.
Mm-hmm.
And just to highlight, like the burnt offerings are part of the daily sacrificial system.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, we're very sanitized in our Western modern culture,
right?
To the point where, most of you listening to this have never killed an animal,
right?
And not to be gruesome, but I have. And not even the way I intended. Like when you go hunting and you don't kill them the way you wanted to kill them, then sometimes you do have to end up, dispatching in a very real, intimate setting. And I'm trying to think through the liturgy of daily placing your hand on that animal,
right?
And then daily making that prayer, and then slitting that animal's throat.
Right. And then the blood would be collected to then be transported over to the actual place.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an entire process. But in Leviticus 16:21, Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins. So you're saying this prayer because this animal, this idea of the substitutionary atonement was built right into this sacrificial system. So the worshiper would like place their hand on the head, say this prayer, slit the throat. They're collecting then the blood to take it over to the altar, and then the priestess then begins assisting with the process and taking preparing the offering, and then they're like dismembering the thing. It's not like they just threw the whole thing whole up onto the altar.
They're butchering it in very specific ways.
Yeah, in specific ways, dismembering it and then putting it up on the altar.
Well, there's quite a bit of mention of like the fatty parts and all the whatever.
Right. So with the whole burnt offering, then everything goes up in smoke. The priests would take the skin. Everything else went up in smoke, which is kind of interesting. The smoke or the skin would stink, like with the hair and stuff.
Yeah.
But then they would use it for writing. I mean, the goat skin, vellum. It'd be for the priesthood, and then they could maybe sell it or whatever else too. But for the most part, it was all incinerated. But with the free will offering, the choice parts were offered to the Lord, and then they would eat the lesser portions. So
yeah. And so you kind of mentioned there, there's the substitutionary idea, and I think this is kind of another area where there's probably some interaction, revelation between the Lord and the people that we don't have recorded in Scripture, which is sometimes maybe troublesome, especially when we get into like gospel conversations, because it certainly seems like, you could easily build a works righteousness into a sacrificial system.
Right. I did the sacrifice.
Yeah, I'm earning my righteousness.
Right.
But then you highlighted a couple other ways that the burnt offering was utilized, not necessarily only
Right.
that substitutionary idea, but then, getting into number 3 and 4 together where there's the belief element.
Yes. So the main reason why they would offer they would offer a burnt offering was to seek the favor of God, which is kind of what we seek to do. We want God's favor. We want God to bless us. And often we don't think through that God is the one that actually provides. He's the one that sustains. He's the one that gives blessing. But he is, especially in our scientific and modern age, we work, and so therefore we get money or blessing or whatever. But God is the one that gives all good things. And the worshiper was seeking the favor of the Lord. So that's an important component of why one would even give the burnt offering, was to seek the favor of the Lord. But if you're seeking the favor of the Lord, okay, why are you doing the burnt offering? For your own personal benefit. And it's not I believe, but it's, oh God, I want you to give me this, so here's me giving this to you. It's like this works contract.
Yeah.
And so one book that I read addressed this specifically because within the pagan religious practices, that's what burnt offerings were. You have to give the deity the animal.
Yeah.
So then you get the favor of the deity.
Which is all over the place in the Odyssey and the Iliad.
Oh yeah, exactly.
All over the place.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, is that there's actually a component where that is true.
Mm-hmm.
In Genesis 22, Abram does what God tells him to do. And at the end of the text, what does he get?
Favor. Yeah.
So there is a component where when you actually do what God says in offering the sacrifice, which we haven't quite talked about what that means, there is a component where God does favor you. And Abram is blessed immensely because of what he did in Genesis 22. And that is an emphasis of the text.
Yeah. And so, well, then clearly we do have, and you did even cite some of these in your article. There are times where the Lord clearly draws a line between the actual practice of the sacrifice and the meaning behind it, where he, points the finger at Israel for doing it on the outside, but not really believing.
Right.
And so.
Mm-hmm. So that idea of belief, it's, that's like was that the 4th point or something?
Yeah.
Of my article.
Yeah.
And belief would be the foundation of it, because when we think of a burnt offering, a lot of times we think, oh, they killed the animal and offered it up. But I have to understand what that animal was. That animal was a source of life. That animal was a source of wealth. So what would be a modern equivalent to like sacrificing an animal?
Getting rid of your best car.
Okay, yeah, some kind of personal possession that you no longer have.
Or, that's not.
I would say even just giving money to the church or to some kind of a work of the Lord kind of ministry or whatever. Because that money, then where is it for you?
No, it's gone.
It's gone. Okay, so, and when you're offering something up to the Lord, which is this animal, you think of a cow and the workforce that a cow is, how much meat is on a cow, to just burn it up and get nothing from it. Well, what is that? What would you call that?
Silly.
It's silly. It's a waste. It's like, why would you do that? That just is dumb. Well,
and instantly entering into the mind of every person is, well, what if I give him like one of my small cows?
Right.
Or like the sick cow,
the gimpy one.
the gimpy cow.
The one that's about to die anyway.
Yeah.
That one's 30 years old. It's not going to make it. Hopefully it lives until we get to the priest's place,
Yeah.
And I mean, we're just going to burn the thing up anyway. So who cares? But obviously God had regulations where he's like, that's not what I want. That's not what's pleasing to me, because that's not real faith. And that's where the belief component comes in. If you're going to incinerate this animal that's actually a source of your wealth, that's going to help build up your affluence, that animal would be used to make more wealth, and you're just going to burn it up. Well, you have to then believe that God is the one that's going to provide for you. You have to believe that even though I totally throw this away and incinerate it, I know that God is good and he will provide for me nonetheless. And you see that in the example of Abram, specifically with Isaac, because God says, I want your son. Well, your son is more important to Abraham than anything. He has tons of animals and he would offer them all up. He doesn't care. You read through Genesis 15, Abraham does not care about money. He does not care about wealth. He has no son. Then God gives him this promised son. And then God says, I want you to give me back your son, your only one, Isaac. In other words, God asks Abraham for everything. And the question is, will Abraham believe? Will he obey God, even though God's asked him to do something that won't work? Because God has promised Abraham also that through Isaac, his descendants will be named. And so Abraham would be like, I don't know how God can work this out. This is impossible. But I believe.
Yeah.
And I'm going to obey. And that's where he's an example to the modern church, where if God asks you to give him everything, what do you need to do? You believe and you obey. And then what will God do? Will he take care of you?
Yes.
He will provide for you, which is why, what does Abraham then name the place?
God will provide.
God will provide. God will see to it. God will take care of it. So God, I'm going to offer this cow up as an offering, knowing and believing that you will provide for me. And then for the New Testament equivalent, how does that apply? Well, your neighbor doesn't have food. They don't have clothing. And in James chapter 2, well, be warm and filled. Oh, I'll pray for you. See you later.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not faith. That's not God. I'm going to give of my substance to help this individual and trust God to provide for me. That you're not being Abraham. Okay, you're being the ancient Israelite who's offering God the cow that's about to die, or you're going through the motions of religion just to be esteemed by others. You're like ancient Israel. And that's where sacrifice then applies to us, where we need to take the blessing and whatever it is that God has given us. And if God says, hey, I want you to use this for that, or I want you to do this, then you say, okay. And guess what? I know that God will provide. So I believe and I trust the Lord to provide for me. So that was a really good study, and a real practical study for an Old Testament sacrificial system that nobody really cares about. Everybody highlights the substitutionary component, not the sacrificial component. Both are there. And I use the illustration of Abraham too, because God tells Abraham, I want your son. In other words, God asks for everything. Mm-hmm. And Abraham says, okay. But then God intervenes, and then he provides a lamb in the thicket. And the ram cost Abraham nothing.
Yeah. So
there's a bit of irony there and some instruction concerning how burnt offerings work. So anyway, that was the article.
I love it. And so I was curious because I wanted to look up that the Lord will provide phrase.
Yeah.
Jehovah or Adonai Jireh. Would this be where people get like Jehovah Jireh?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if you've ever heard people in like the studies of the name of God, Jehovah Jireh, that it's not really a J, but it's Y. It's like a Y. Yeah. Yirah. And it's the verb for see.
Yeah.
So the Lord sees it, sees what's happening. ESV puts a note there. Obviously you can grab the sense of he sees and he meets the need. So he's providing is where they're, we get that translation from. But if you've ever wondered, where does that name come from? Yeah, it comes from there.
It does.
So
and it literally means the Lord will see.
Yeah.
The Lord will see to it. It's like, God, I don't know how this is going to work out, but guess what? I believe you. I'm going to trust you, and he will see to it.
Awesome. Well, good article, Tim. You should reach out to your buddy Mark Ward, and we should get him on our podcast. We should get him to come over here, and
that would be good. He would do that.
Yeah, I want to hear him like lay a smackdown on King James onlyism, because I know he's talked about that before.
That's his area of expertise for sure.
So anyway, let's have a final meditation in God's word. And the passage that we will be looking at is Hebrews chapter 1, as tempting as it would be to go to Hebrews 11 and talk about the faith of Abraham, believing that he would raise his son Isaac from the dead. We're going to look at chapter 1. I think I've already mentioned there's just a couple of guys in my church. We're studying through Hebrews. And so just been studying and reading there. And the main theme of Hebrews, it as an incredibly articulate treatise on how Jesus is better than so many of the Old Testament worship systems. So including the sacrificial system, but so much more than that. How Jesus is such a superior priest and mediator to God for us. And in that great treatise that is this epistle, he uses Old Testament quotation and allusion heavily. And so as we progress through the text, not just this one, but through, into chapter 1 and beyond, we're going to see a lot of quotations from the Old Testament that are messianic or kingly. He's applying ideas to Christ very beautifully. And so, but what we're going to see in this opening text is really that Jesus is better as a form of revelation to us. Jesus is better than the old system of communication, which was the prophets. It's how the epistle of Hebrews opens, and it's almost without any introduction. And it almost opens up just like a story, like a long, long time ago. That's literally what Hebrews opens with. In many times, palu meros, like many times, and palu, man, I gotta make that bigger. My eyes are so bad. Palutropos, many ways. So like the many ways, many times, before, long ago.
Long ago in
That's
the galaxy.
The opening. It's this palumeros, palutropos, tropos. Yeah, I said that right. Pale hatheos. It's like God, and many times, long ago, spoke to the fathers in the prophets. Like that's the opening of the story here. Long, long time ago, God spoke through the prophets. But in these last days, and depending on how you look at that, he could be talking about like last days in an eschatological sense. Like here's the king, the end of the times type of a discussion. But in these last days, he has spoken not through the prophets, but to us, he has spoken through his son. And what follows is 7 descriptions of the son. So just this grand opening, long, long time ago, he used to speak through the prophets, and now it's not the prophets anymore. It's Jesus, the Son, and who is the Son? And so let's look, we're going to walk through those descriptions. And so description number 1, whom he appointed the heir of all, the one who would inherit all things. That is who Jesus is. He's the heir of all things. And this is likely a direct allusion or quotation of Psalm 2. I will make you, I'd have to pull it up and to quote it perfectly, but Psalm 2 verse 8. Let's just do that. Which he's going to bring up Psalm 2 again in verse 5. But here's Psalm 2, verse 8. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, your inheritance, and the ends of the earth your possession. And so a very messianic, kingly psalm. And here he's saying, guess who is the one who inherits the earth and all the things? The Son.
Mm-hmm.
The revelation that God's given to you and I, he's the one who will inherit all things. That's description number 1. And it's almost an alluded fulfillment or symbolic application of Psalm 2 to Christ, which he's going to definitely do in verse 5, but he's kind of like just foreshadowing it now. So that's description 1. Description 2, through whom he also created the worlds. So here, unlike Lady Wisdom in Proverbs, here's a direct mention of Christ creating. So who is the Son? He's the heir of all things. He's the one who created the worlds. And it's not the typical word for worlds there. It's the like ages. It's not just the physical, but it's like all of it, like the creation of time itself, like the universe existing is through the Son. It's a really beautiful descriptor based on the action of who Christ is. So that's number 2. He is the creator of the worlds. The third description, he is the radiance of the glory. So this is like the brightness that comes off of the Father. Here is Christ, and he radiates that same glory. And the fourth description, very similar to number 3, the imprint of his nature, referring to the Father. So the same brightness of the glory that the Father possesses, the Son radiates that same glory. And the nature that the Father possesses, the Son has that exact imprint. And it's not the exact same wording, but that word for imprint there is like when you would stamp a face on a coin. You know, so like on a penny, you've got Abraham Lincoln. You're like, it's Abraham Lincoln. Or George Washington, he's on that quarter. And it's kind of that idea, like it's the stamping, like the same nature of the Father is the imprint, the Son is imprinting that same nature to us. And so, not to get caught in the language, but it's just saying description 3 and 4, Christ and the Father share in their essence. So it's a strong statement to the deity of the Son of God. So description number 5.
It's a very Trinitarian passage.
Oh yeah.
I hadn't thought about it from that perspective before, but it is. It's like very Christ exalting. Christ is God.
Yeah, very like you almost similar in essence to how Colossians describes him.
Yeah.
It's he's the firstborn of creation. He's the same as the Father.
And then this next description too.
Yeah, and then he upholds, description 5, all with the word of his power. And so he's keeping it all. He's created it all. He's the same essence of the Father. He keeps all of this through his word. And then description 6, making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, or at the majesty in the heights. And so great descriptions of what Jesus has done. You know, so he's the creator of the world, he keeps the world, and then he sat down after making purification for sins, which this fits so well with what we just talked about with burnt offerings, which what Hebrews will go on to describe is that the sacrificial system in Israel was perpetual. The priest never sat down because there's still more sacrifices for sin. Year by year, animal by animal, it was never fully atoning. But when this lamb died, the priest, which by the way, he's also the priest and the sacrifice, but when he made that offering of himself for our sin,
right,
he is exalted and he sat In the heights next to the majesty on high, he sat down at the right hand of God because the work was done.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the sitting down is often like, especially if one's sitting on a throne, in the Old Testament, it's like sitting down is a symbol of power. I've sat in my position and now I have the power to do X, Y, and Z. But in this text, it clearly states it's after making purification.
Yeah.
It's connecting it to the sacrificial system.
Yeah, it's
And
directly quote.
He's sitting down because he's done.
There's no more
There's
sacrifice.
no more.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're done.
And then he's definitely going to come back to that theme, in Hebrews 8 and 9.
Right. Yep.
That no more blood of bulls and goats. We don't need that anymore.
Yep.
And so beautiful description number 6 there. And we could talk about that much more, but we'll go on to number 7. Having become as much greater than the angels as the name he inherited is better. And this is my own kind of translation here. And so we started off with, long time ago, God spoke through the prophets. And, it was lots of prophets, and they spoke a lot of things. They made predictions. It was, a huge gaps of time. And here is one man making a very clear message to us. And, obviously we can talk about the gospel with his description in number 6 there. But then he transitions in that last description to what he's about to talk to, which is the position of the Son being higher than any other position. Namely, how could Christ, if he was born human, how could he still be greater than the angelic beings? And he's going to make quite an argument that he is so much greater than the angels, which we'll look at in another episode. But the argument he's going to make is that the name he has, he's as greater than the angels to the extent that his name is greater than the angels. And what is his name? And it's not Jesus. It's not talking about his actual, like, my name's Charlie, your name's Tim. He's talking about his title.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some sweet titles, Michael the Archangel. But what's the title of Christ, of Jesus? He's the Son of God.
Yeah.
He is the second member, the son of the Trinitarian God.
Right.
Like, how could an angel ever attain that title? And they couldn't. They can't. Like, he is so, even in his incarnation, as the author will continue to describe, even temporarily subjected lower in physical form, he's still much greater than them because of his exaltation to the right hand of the Father. He is the Son. And really, it's a magnificent opening to this epistle that gives us a glorious, powerful picture of who Jesus is. And even in that radiance, it reminds us of the sacrifice he made, purifying our sins. And just how beautiful. This is what's so amazing about the gospel, is you have a God that is so far above us, transcends humanity, yet is willing to give up that power, that position, to take on human flesh, to submit himself even to death on the cross, so that he could redeem those who've rebelled against him. And that contrast in the glory and the gory just doesn't make sense to us. Like, if you genuinely think about that, this is the only man who should never have died.
Right.
But yet through one man's death, all died. And through one man's death, all live. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful picture of the glory of Christ and the gospel that he's going to begin to express. And we'll just stop there. And then we'll continue through chapter 1 in future episodes, where we go back into the Old Testament, and whoever the author of Hebrews is pulling these quotations with such precision to so perfectly show us this is the Messianic King.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I was studying through this, I had a couple of other passages come to my mind, and we won't look at them. I'll just reference them. The first is Genesis 3. So here's the guy. He has such a greater title than all these others. He's the Son. And you think all the way back to Genesis 3, and here offspring is promised.
Oh, okay.
Like,
Yeah.
Eve, you're going to have a son. And even when she has that son, she's like, look, we've
Mhm.
got a son. And I think she's mistakenly thinking this is the fulfillment.
Mhm.
And, Hebrews 1 is like, no. This is that guy.
Mhm.
This is him. And there's obviously many other places that clearly declare that,
Mhm.
not the least of which is his own baptism, where the heavens open and God says, this is my son. But this is the writer of Hebrews pointing all the way back to the beginning of Scripture, saying, this is that guy. This is that guy. And my mind went to that. I opened up Genesis and read through that and was like, this is him. This is him. And then the other one is Titus 2:11 through 13. And for the grace of God that brings salvation hath appeared to all men. And here's the revelation of God to mankind in these last days. And it is his Son. And it's his Son in holiness. It's his Son in glory and beauty and power, but then lifted up on a cross to die for our sins.
Mhm.
And that is the message of hope for a lost and dying world. And, there's a lot of other things that we might want God to tell us, and they don't even compare. Like, here's his message.
Mhm.
You are desperate in need of help, and I helped you.
Mhm.
And this is how I did it. His name is Jesus. And so Hebrews tees up for us another great reminder of the beauty of the gospel. And so hopefully that message encourages you to remember who Christ is, remember what he's done for you, what he consistently does in his upholding of the universe he created, that you would glory and cherish in the risen Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And with that, we just say thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Thinklings podcast. We would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback, suggestions, or potential topics that you'd like us to discuss, you can contact us through our email, thinklingspodcast@gmail.com. Remember, don't let this conversation end with this podcast. Read good books, talk about them with your friends, and always continue to cultivate your mind. See you next time on the Thinklings podcast. Is our personal production. Our conversations, book discussions, and viewpoints may not represent the views of Faith Baptist Bible College and Theological Seminary. Any questions or feedback should be directed to us at the Thinklings Podcast.